And I guess we are live now. Let me know. I'll just pull off the stream here and see if it's actually starting. Looks like it. Anyway, we're just gonna start out. All right. Welcome to the stream. And I think I want to start by apologizing. I did actually postpone this by 2 hours. I had to do some stuff, and hopefully it also works out better for all of you guys. But yeah, feel free to use the chat. We're going to talk about some different things today. And first of all, thanks to each one of you actually being here live. And if you're not live watching it right now, thank as well. I got a schedule for some of the stuff we're going to talk about. So we are going to talk about the channel walkthrough, something I've teased for in the past. So it's long overdue. And then we will have some sort of Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat, and I'll do my best to actually look at it from time to time. And of course, we're going to look at some of the upcoming content. And I will also talk about how I'm actually connected to two of the sources that inspired Tolkien. And that is Beowulf, and then from Norse mythology, the story about Sigurd and the dragon Fafnir. So that's pretty interesting. All right, it looks like people are actually tuning in. So nice to see you in the chat. And I don't feel too well today, so I do apologize for that. I had hoped to be just a little more energetic. But, you know, life. So, for starters, I think we are going to do the channel walkthrough. So let me just pull it up. Where is it? So I'm going to disable that. And all right. So I've long wanted to do this sort of channel walkthrough, and since I got the idea, a lot of stuff has changed, both on YouTube, but also some of the stuff and content I actually create. So let's just start from the end. There used to be some cool stuff with icons up here, so you could actually click on them, but yeah, YouTube, they changed stuff, so it's all down here. So if you want to find the Patreon, join Discord, show the merchandise store, Reddit, Twitter, or X, and Instagram, so easy to find. And the first video is usually the newest video, not always, like this isn't actually the newest one, but it's the video I think most of you guys would be interested in. Then there are the channel members, of course, upcoming live streams, and then there's the recommendation from the algorithm. I'm actually not entirely sure how it works yet, but yeah, it seems to be mainly Rings of Power stuff, so I guess it has something to do with the amount of views as well. Then there is videos in chronological order. Pretty straightforward. Same with the popular videos. And then we have playlists, and we're going to talk more about them, those in a minute. And then there's the members only videos, and one of the playlists with the series I'm working on, the Second Age series. I guess some of you guys have some questions about that, so we will talk about that in a moment. And then there are some other channels I recommend. My other channel, which some of you might know. And there are other great Tolkien channels as well. I mainly watch Tolkien lore. I think he has some interesting stuff to discuss from time to time. So if you don't know him, go and check it out. And there's far more, of course. You can look for yourselves. Then we have videos, of course. Pretty straightforward. Everyone knows this, but you can switch between popular and oldest. And then we have the shorts. I don't expect to make more of those. I don't really think it's good content, if that makes sense. At least not the content I want to make in the future. I think it's really limited what you can do in 1 minute, and I wouldn't really consider it good content. It could be funny, and interesting, but when we talk about Tolkien and the deeper lore, I can't really do that in just 1 minute. So I don't really see anything good about continuing down this path. I'm sure you get a lot of views, but most of the subscribers you gain through shorts won't actually watch your longer form videos. So, it's, I wouldn't say a waste of time, but almost. So I think those are done, at least for now. Then we have the live stream. So this is currently going on, as you probably know, otherwise I don't know why you're here. And then we have the stream later today, where we will play Return to Moria again. And then of course Hobbit Day. Then we have the playlists, and there are some different kind of videos. I'm gonna show you a couple of them in a moment. But we have some of the newer ones, like Tolkien Inspirations and the Artifacts of Middle-earth. Those only have a video each, and I don't expect to make more about Kingdoms of Arda, at least not anytime soon. Then pretty much everything related to gaming. I also hosted the Tolkien Reading Day last year, my own series, the reviews for The Rings of Power. There's also this playlist with all the other videos. So there's, as you know, a ton to say about it, because, it's not very good. Then we have all the specials. There's a ton of those, including this live stream, but it's more experimental, and I've tried some different things to see what would work, both for you guys, the algorithm, and what would perhaps be trendy on YouTube. It has worked quite well sometimes, and other times, not so well. And then we have the short series about the Fall of Arnor, finally finished. It was long overdue, but I'm really glad it got through at the end. I think one of the challenges with that one was really that by the time I came to the third video, I really wanted to do it differently. Not because it's bad per se, but the structure and the way I'm writing now is very different from when I started the channel. So I at least feel myself. So that was why it took so long to make the third episode. And it also means that I will likely make more videos about the Fall of Arnor at some point, and perhaps sort of redo the whole series in a different way, hopefully more interesting as well. Then there's the members only videos. I have changed some of them over the past year or two. So yeah, there's also some of them on Patreon, I think, but yeah. The main ones is probably down at the bottom. So we have the Creatures of Middle-earth, the Middle-earth Theories, Tolkien Explained, and Character Stories. And these are pretty much just the shorts, I think. So what I do differently from most other channels, I think, I try to have some structure. And I say try because it doesn't always work that way. So if we just look up one of the videos, so you see, the last part of the title is actually referring to the playlist. So it's a bit easier for you guys to actually see that this video is actually just part of a playlist. Doesn't work every time, of course, but I've tried to do it especially with the Creatures of Middle-earth series and with the character stories. Hopefully that makes it just slightly easier to actually use the playlist and find some of the content you might be interested in. Then of course we have the community, and it used to be extremely active. There used to be a post every day, and I think on Mondays it was memes, and then a trivia, a quiz. Wednesdays were characters against each other and so forth. And you know, it was great fun to make, but it also took maybe 5 hours to schedule what would come out for a month. And at some point I started to realize that, well, it was good engagement, and you know, you guys loved it and I enjoyed it too, and you know, lots of comments and so forth, and people still learned some stuff. But at the end, those 5 hours could have been used to create a video, and that would be more beneficial for the growth of the channel, and you know, sort of changing this whole project, if we can call it that, into a business. So I can actually you know, make this to my at least part-time job. So you know, I had to think about where I put my hours and what the output of that is. So that's why we don't have all the trivia and so forth. The other reason, which I also think is pretty important, is because it sort of buries some of the good stuff. Let's just scroll down. So as you know, I've actually been reviewing some Tolkien books, or rather, you know, stuff about the universe at least. And I don't want that sort of content to be buried beneath trivia or memes and stuff. While that is great, I don't think it's on par, if that makes sense. And now that we are actually talking about this, if you are interested in stuff like this, like the Lord of the Rings and philosophy, I have made some reviews about these books. There are a few more I will show in a minute, and you can actually read this book review for free on Patreon. I think you just need an account, that's it. So yeah, this book isn't really great. It's quite unique. Each chapter is written by a different author, so some of the chapters are really good, but sadly for all of us, some of the first couple of chapters are pretty bad. I shared a screenshot from one of the first pages, and it was written by a woman called Alison Milbank, if memory serves. And she talked about Sheila being a Freudian, I will pronounce it wrong here because of YouTube, vagina dentata. So yeah, quite an interesting theory, let's call it that. And I posted this image on Reddit, on the Lord of the Rings subreddit, and it went semi-viral in a couple of days, almost 500,000 views. So, you know, it might be one of the topics I will debunk at some point, because it's really weird, and I don't agree with it. So yeah, there's more to say about this, but it's not really worth it because it's not that good. And likewise, we have Peter Kreeft. He has some good stuff, but he's extremely biased. I think he's Catholic, at least Christian, so he sort of overinterprets some of the stuff and basically calls Frodo Jesus. And while you could say he is Christ-like, I think you would be wrong to say he's the same. And I think Tolkien would say the same, so I don't really recommend this book unless you know the lore really well. Otherwise, you might learn some bad stuff from him. But I think the opening of this book is one of the best I've ever read, and it's I took some inspiration from it for one of my upcoming videos, but we will return to that. And I think the most important one is The Road to Middle-earth by Tom Shippey, and this is the revised edition. I'm not sure if you can actually read that, but I recommend the revised edition because it also includes an additional chapter where he comes upon the film adaptation by Peter Jackson. So that's really interesting. And the old version is not entirely accurate because he wrote it before the History of Middle-earth came out. So I highly recommend this, and there's also a book review on Patreon. I think you need to be a dwarf or above to actually read it, but I'm not entirely sure. And I'm currently reading Tolkien on fairy stories. It's all right. I don't hate it. I think there's some really interesting stuff in it if you want to understand some of the stuff Tolkien put into his stories underneath, well, between pages and lines, really. He actually wrote this essay before The Lord of the Rings, or at least while writing it. So before it was published, at least. And yeah, I'm pretty much halfway through it, as you can see. I've read what Tolkien wrote and the commentary and the notes, and that's pretty interesting. And then I've come to the manuscripts, so some of the stuff he left out. So I'm not super motivated to actually finish this book, but at some point I will, and then I will make a review as well. Also, this essay can be found in other books, but I recommend this one because it's the expanded edition with commentary and notes. So once again, it's a sort of better version, if you can call it that, with some extra stuff. All right. And then, of course, lastly, we have the memberships and the store. There's actually a lot more to be found if you actually visit the website. And I'm currently wearing, I'm not sure if you can actually see it, but it's one of the t-shirts from my own store. And by chance of fate, there's actually a 50% discount today with free shipping. So if you want to buy something, check it out. And that's pretty much the channel walkthrough. So just gonna do that. All right. And I think a lot more people have tuned in. So I'm gonna read some of the questions you have now and hopefully answer some of them. And then we can talk about some of the upcoming videos and what I really hope to get out of making those. Of course, views would always be great, but there's a lot more to it. All right. All right, let's see what you have. Never imagined you like that. Well, yeah, I've read that. Sadly, for all of you, I'm not some old British man. Light mode. Oh yeah. Yeah, I use light mode on YouTube, except on the other browser. But yeah. And if you don't know, yesterday we actually published a short video about moths, which is a bit of an inside joke on the Discord server. And yeah, for some reason I promised to do a video about cats if we hit 50,000 subscribers. So if you want that, ask your friends to subscribe. Right. All right. So it doesn't look like there's any questions so far, but personally love on fairy stories help me reconcile Christianity with paganism. Yeah, you know, let's talk about that. A lot of people get fairy stories wrong, which really annoyed Tolkien. And it's also pretty much what his whole essay is about. And yesterday we briefly talked about eucatastrophe. I hate that word. But yeah, it's a sudden turn where the forces of good overcome a hopeless situation. So that's why the eagles, you know, suddenly come and help at the Battle of Morannon, the Battle of the Five Armies, and it's also why Eru, or God, intervenes concerning the destruction of the One Ring. He basically makes Gollum fall. So, you know, it's that sort of stuff that is fundamental to actual fairy stories. And that's pretty much what the essay is about. There's a lot of other stuff in it, but that's some of the main points at least. Wearing a fake ring, yeah. Yeah, the moths are a true threat. No, I haven't actually heard about a new Beowulf movie. That's interesting. We're actually going to talk a lot more about that in a moment, but I think before we get to that point, I will move on to the next point of my agenda. So let me just pull it up. All right. So we're going to talk about some of the future content on the channel. You know, I just realized something. Let me just change this for a moment. You know, we're going to start with a different thumbnail. Where is it? There it is. All right. So while I hate the Rings of Power and have talked a lot about it, I would prefer to change the channel and rather talk about some stuff I actually like about Tolkien and his, you know, whole universe. And I think the core to that is often the deeper stuff. So it's more on a philosophical level. And the next love child, if you can call it that, of a video is going to be this one. And I have titled it The Orc Within Us. And it's really going to talk about how orcs may not be as different as we think or hope. Perhaps there are orcish sides in all of us. And I think Tolkien's experiences during World War I was a true inspiration for him to create these creatures. So there's a lot of interesting things to talk about in this regard, but I don't want to spoil too much here. I finished the script for this video on Wednesday, I think. So if you want to read the script, you actually can on Patreon. But let's get back the other one. All right. So I got a lot of videos planned, And I guess my biggest enemy is time. I think I have like 1,000 videos I want to make, so I have to prioritize what I actually spend time on. And I've tried to nail it down to 8 videos. Well, technically 9, I just showed you one more. But these 8 videos are the kind of stuff I really want to talk about. So I'll just cover them briefly so you have an idea what we're actually talking about here. So down in the corner we have the archetype of the king. It's actually something that inspired me from a different channel you might know called Like Stories of Old. And he made 4 videos about the archetypes. So we have the king, warrior, magician, and lover. And I bought the book myself. I thought it was a really interesting topic. And to me, it's quite clear he doesn't know the lore too well. So I think there's a ton more to say about it. I actually got it right here. So it's from this book by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. And it talks about the king, warrior, magician, and lover. So these are 4 masculine archetypes. So just to cover it briefly, for the king, we have the ideal king, and it is actually Aragorn in a way. And I think he's the best example. But then you have the bipolar, dysfunctional version of the king, who is the active one, the tyrant, and the passive one, the weakling. So it's a really fascinating topic, and I think there's a lot of things we could talk about in this regard. So it would not just be about, Aragorn. It would also be some of the other characters and how they reflect this archetype. The challenge for me about this video is that I would have to structure 4 scripts at the same time, because I would have to write the other scripts, of course. Otherwise, it's just going to end up like the Fall of Arno series, and I don't want people to wait 2 years for it to actually finish. So it's not high on my list, and I might take some elements from it and introduce in some of the other videos, just to see if there's any interest in it. But yeah, great book if people are interested in masculine archetypes. And above it we have one called The Philosophy of Middle-earth. And this is actually related to some of the other videos here. But it is actually just the philosophy about Tolkien, but specifically about the cosmology of the world. So I think what's truly interesting about his universe is that the world truly comes to life, and it feels different from many other, settings like Star Wars and so forth. And I think it has a lot to do with the philosophy put into his world creating. So I got a lot of stuff to talk about in that regard. So yeah, just to name one minor thing, we have the mountain of Caradhras, but in our world we would just see it as a mountain, but in this universe it actually sort of has a personality. It's not just a mountain. It's basically what stops the Fellowship from actually using the pass. And it's sort of the same with some objects, like the ring. It sort of has a will of its own. And let me just get some water. All right. Yeah, and then we have Gurthang, the Sword of Turin. We only have 2 talking objects actually in the whole story, and one of them is the sword. And some people have interpreted like it's just in his head. After all, it's the last thing he hears before he, ends his own life. And the other talking object is actually from The Hobbit, which is the talking purse of one of the trolls. I think it's William, but I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, so we don't have a lot of objects talking, but there are certain things that seem to come to life, and I think is really unique in this setting. And I also think it's some of the things Amazon failed to understand, because well, you know, the rings affect the characters like we saw in the last episode with King Durin, but it's still just an object, if that makes sense. You don't have a feeling that it has a personality of some sort, and you really get that if you read some of Tolkien's books, not just the Lord of the Rings. I think an interesting example I've also made a whole video about is actually in The Hobbit. After Bilbo finds the One Ring, he tries to escape Goblin Town, and then the ring just slips off his finger on purpose. So he becomes visible to the orcs. So, you know, the ring wants him to be found. Yeah, you know, it has a will of its own. And it's really the same with the Isildur. So, you know, I find it truly fascinating, at least. And then we have a different video, the nature of magic. I have actually sort of teased for some of the stuff I will cover in my response video to Asmongold, the first one. So to keep it briefly, it's really how magic is connected to words and song, which I think is something a lot of people don't really get right when they talk about magic in this world. And it also stands out from, you know, other universes like Harry Potter, where it's pretty much, well, you know, stuff flying around and stuff, and flashy light, which, you know, is cool as well, but it's very, very different from the kind of magic we see in Middle-earth. So I wanted to talk more about that, at least. Let me think. So yeah, you know, it's all connected really much to the Ainur Lindale, the music of the Ainur, and that also sort of connects pretty well with you know, Christianity, where the world was created with word, and that word was God. So I'm gonna talk more about that, at least. I find it really fascinating. And those two videos are actually related to the philosophy of Tolkien. It's a video I've wanted to do for a long time, and it's also the reason why I'm reading all these books. It's basically research, so I know, you know, what I'm talking about, and I know the good stuff, the bad stuff. You know, even a person like Peter Kreeft, you know, it's not a perfect book. There's some pretty bad stuff in it, but there's also some interesting points. So, you know, there's a lot to talk about in this regard. I'm still not really sure what it should contain, but it might at least touch on the subject of the nature of evil, which is based on the philosophy of the Augustinian nature of evil. So in Middle-earth, good is default. So evil is actually the absence of good. And we see this repeated over and over again. So no one is truly evil per se, and at least not in the beginning, which is also what Elrond says at the Council of Elrond, speaking about Sauron. So yeah, you know, there's a ton of stuff I could talk about. Yeah, let's just jump to the next one. So the real protagonist. I don't want to spoil what I'm going to say in it, but I will say that I don't consider it truly to be one of the three characters presented on the thumbnail. And no, it's not Sam either. Yeah, I think I don't want to say more than that. Then we have the epic versus modern, which is, you know, I think it's a good time to make this sort of video due to the Rings of Power. But it's about epics, you know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf to some extent, and of course the Lord of the Rings. And so it's basically what are the characteristics of these types of stories versus modern ideals. And it's really interesting because you can't have modern ideals and epics. They basically go against each other. So just to name two things. There's often a question about morality. So morality is a bit more ambiguous in modern stories. I guess you have seen it all in films, games, what have you. So there's the difference between good and evil is more questionable, and most characters have become great characters, and we don't have really that in epics, at least not to the same extent. And I think it's one of the points they fail with in the Rings of Power in regard to Sauron. They don't really understand why he is evil. And if they had actually read some of Tolkien's letters, they would know the answer. Because sure, you could question, is it truly evil to kill someone if it's done in the service of good? So, you know, there's a lot of stuff to talk about just regarding that, but they don't really understand that what fundamentally makes Sauron evil is that he is basically rebelling against the will of God, or Eru. So he wants to be worshipped as a god king. He wants to control and dominate and have slaves or servants. So, you know, it's not really something you get from the Rings of Power. And, you know, that's one of the things that I think they get wrong. There's a ton of things, really. So yeah, that's one thing. And then there's the whole sort of idea that in modern stories it's always, I would say, selfish. It's always about the individuals. And in epics, it's normally about a hero trying to save his people, you know, sacrifice himself for the greater good. So again, doesn't really match very well. Yeah, there's a ton more to say. And then we have the glorify war. And you might be wondering, what do I mean by that? So let me just grab some water. Right. So Tolkien has a lot of critics. He even had that when he published The Lord of the Rings and so forth. And, you know, some of these critics say that he is glorifying war. Now, I don't agree with that statement. And to be honest, I think most people that would think that, at least the critics, haven't read Tolkien. And they have most likely just seen Peter Jackson's films, which, broadly speaking, do glorify war to some extent, at least more than Tolkien actually does. So it's really a video that sort of debunks this whole idea and also dives into some of the things Tolkien actually wrote regarding war and battle. And, well, I mean, if you know anything about Tolkien and his World War I experiences, you probably know that he wouldn't really glorify it. In fact, he was sort of against it, especially this idea about finding glory on the battlefield. It's just an illusion pretty much. And it's also actually some of the things I'll talk about in part 2. So we have a sort of exception, I would almost say, where we have the contest between Legolas and Gimli. So I will talk about that, and also about Eowyn. Now, in the film version, they sort of make it seem like a good thing that she wants glory on the battlefield, and a lot of people sort of misinterpret her character to think she's some sort of a feminist icon, and she is to some extent, but not in the way they think. And I think Peter Jackson truly failed her character arc. I'm not really sure if he didn't understand the character well enough or what the problem is here. But her story never ends in the film. And, she wants to achieve glory on the battlefield, and she does. I mean, she defeats the Witch King of Angmar, the greatest servant of Sauron. What more glory can you get than that? And yet, it's never really praised, like at all. Nobody really mentioned it. There are no songs about it, unlike some of the other great deeds we hear about. So, and I think it really highlights the idea that true glory can't really be found on the battlefield. And I think that's also one of the reasons why she sort of changes her path. And instead she becomes a healer and lives in Ithilien with Faramir and, cares about things growing. I think that's a very Tolkienian thing. But then we have some modern feminists that think, oh, that's so typical. That's just the role women should have. But no, it's really not. Especially not in Tolkien's eyes. I mean, some of the greatest heroes are gardeners, like Sam, Will, and Faramir, and so forth. And even Aragorn is a healer, which is also what the archetype of the king is really about, among other things, of course. So yeah, I think he failed. Regarding Eowyn and her story, at least. So yeah, if you have any questions about these videos, feel free to ask. Let me just check the chat before we move on. All right. Five starry, yeah. I'm not really sure what you're talking about, except it's about Sweden and Norway. That's great, I guess. Were the Rays in possession of the rings during the events of the Lord of the Rings, or did Sauron withhold them? It's actually sort of a mistake that I think it's during the chapter of the Council of Elrond, where I think it's Gandalf that says that they still possess the rings, but elsewhere, I think it's 4 places, it's mentioned that they were actually kept by Sauron in Barad-dûr, or at least most likely in Barad-dûr. So from all we know, they don't actually wear the rings. And just to take a step back and again talk about the nature of evil, as I said, actually evil is the absence of good, which also means that evilness in itself lacks substance. And I think the Nazgul is a great example of this, because they are so evil in a way that they are nothing. the only way they can interact with the seen world is due to their garments. This is also why after the confrontation at the forts of Bruinen, they lose their cloaks and have to walk back to Mordor, or Minas Morgul, somewhere at least, to get new garments so they can actually interact with the physical world, the seen world. And it's really sort of the same with the Barrow-wights. It's actually something I had tried to implement into my script for episode 4, but I had to cut it out. But yeah, they are evil spirits, basically using the remains of the dead. And a lot of people sort of get it wrong and think it's actually the dead sort of coming to life, but it's really not. It's just these evil spirits using the bones and what else remains there what might be, and through that they can actually interact with the seen world. So yeah, that also means that if you actually destroyed the body or corpse or whatever you want to call it, they would be unable to latch onto anything and actually interact again. So yeah, it's an interesting topic. The real protagonist was the ring. It's actually not what I'm going to suggest, but it's one of the things I present and then sort of debunks. But all right, I'm gonna spoil what it's about. The real protagonist of the Lord of the Rings and actually all the other stories is Middle-earth, Middle-earth itself. So we have these sort of, the world is fading and we have the ages. And there's a lot more points, but I don't want to spoil it all here. But I do think the real protagonist is actually Middle-earth, and is also the only thing that actually is in every chapter, because we have a lot of characters that are in every chapter, and there's also a lot of chapters without the ring. Especially if we also take a look at the stories outside of the Lord of the Rings. So, the world is pretty much the real protagonist in a way. And special thanks to J-H. I hope I pronounced that right. Thank you very much. All right, so we have some comment about the War of the Rohirrim. It's one of the stories I really looked forward to, but not so much anymore. I really liked the concept art and hoped that the story would go sort of like that, so more lore accurate and actually also, in my opinion, better looking. Because but yeah, it's anime, so I think that was a bit of a letdown. I'd hoped for something more realistic, but yeah, they have changed her story a lot, and I have a few videos also about shield maidens. Yeah, I don't really approve of the changes. I don't really approve of any changes in general, but I think the problem with some of these changes is that, they don't really improve the story. Just modern ideals pushed into it, which, again, this video is really much about all that. I think one thing that sort of made me sigh was when Hera commented upon her father wanting her to marry Wolf, and she said something along the lines that he doesn't even notice her in the room or something like that. And it's just arranged marriages. It happens, and it has happened for centuries, even millennia, I guess, and it still happens pretty much in most of the world, I guess, at least outside of the West. So to even comment upon this, it's a very Western view, and I don't really think it fits into the story. It just sort of have become a cliche. It's predictable that they would comment upon this whole idea about a woman being forced into a marriage, while in the setting they probably wouldn't even talk about this. So it's tiresome. It's a tiresome trope at this point. And if they really wanted to make it interesting and almost provocative, they would actually have her wanting to get married to some rich lord, either the steward of Gondor, or even more interesting, perhaps she actually wants to marry Wolf, but her father is against it. It would have been a lot more interesting, and character-wise, I think it would also make for some depth, and go away from the girl boss kind of character she sort of seems like. I know the Japanese trailer was slightly better and has a lot of Hera, but yeah, I don't have much hope for it. Anyway, yeah, all right, so let me just keep this up. So let's see if there's any more questions. Yeah, Simon Tolkien is truly one of the problems with the estate. I guess many people already know this, but if not, there was an interview, I think it was around the time The Hobbit came out, but he was basically saying that Peter Jackson was perhaps a bit too faithful to the books, and he wanted him to be less faithful, which is very much against what his father wanted, Christopher Tolkien, back when he was alive. And I think for any true fan of Tolkien, they would rather have wanted him to be more accurate rather than less accurate. Just to return to the subject, one of the modern things introduced by Peter Jackson is, of course, Arwen have a bigger role. So she basically took the role that Glorfindel had in the book, which is sort of fine. I can live with that at least. But they just, they kept increasing the importance of Arwen to the point where, I don't know why, but for some damn reason, her fate is tied to the ring, which is, they want to increase the tension and drama in the story, but it just becomes, pointless, because at the point, it's when Elrond hands the reforged sword, Anduril, to Aragorn, and then he tells him that now the fate of Arwen is tied to the ring, which is just, another push that you got to do something crazy, otherwise Sauron is going to win and you are not going to get Arwen. And it's, it's just, I think it's unnecessary because, you introduce more drama to the story than what is actually needed, if that makes sense. It's, it sort of changes the whole point about being there. in the book there's a prophecy, which is why he takes the path of the dead, whereas in the film it's somehow changed to Elrond shows up, hands a sword, you go visit the dead, use the dead to defeat Mordor. Nah, I don't really like that change. And it's one of those things I really think you should be extremely good at balancing, because it just becomes tiresome at some point. And it's not unique, because every story that comes out now has some sort of female warrior character. So it would be interesting if they tried to do something new. Perhaps she just wants to protect her family, anything except the usual stuff. So yeah, that's also why I'm a bit concerned about the War of the Rohirrim. So to get back to Simon Tolkien, I don't really agree with his opinions, and I'm not really sure how much he has been involved with the Rings of Power, but it sounds like he has been involved quite substantially. And from what I know, he also approved of several things that Amazon didn't actually have the rights for, but they could use either way. I at least also remember his name being credited in one of the episodes of season 1. And yes, you are completely right. It took 2 to kill the Witch King. So it's, everyone gets all the credits, but she's actually not alone. All right. All right. Any questions? Oh, yeah. Yeah, and one of the other things about the War of the Rohirrim is Helm Hammerhand saying, "You could rule the world." Where to start? First of all, the Rohirrim don't have a desire to be world conquerors, and they are sort of in an alliance / subject status with Gondor. There's the Oath of Ale, where they basically have to help Gondor in times of need, but it doesn't really work the other way around. And please don't talk about the line about Theoden and where was Gondor, because I really hate that line. But yeah, they wouldn't say that. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense for the character. Doesn't make sense for the people. It doesn't make sense for the history of Middle Earth, like, at all. And honestly, it sounds more like something Sauron would say. Yeah, doesn't sound like a good thing, at least. Yeah, he speaks as if we are not even in the room. Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I meant. Girl bosses are here to stay, deal with it. I don't really mind them per se. I just don't think that the cliche kind of girl boss is interesting as a character. It just becomes a copy of the same character pushed into every story at this point. Like I said, try something new. Even with Hera, it would be more interesting if she'd actually approved of arranged marriages. It would be different, at least. Will you live stream more often? I guess it depends on you guys. It would be interesting. I'm really not an expert on this. It's also the first time with a webcam, so if it works out well, perhaps I will. I will at least stream later in 2 hours and 30 minutes. where we will return to Moria. So I think that game is really picking up. It's really good, especially after the Golden update. So we will play that, and for the first time on Steam. So I guess a lot of people wanted that. So if you haven't bought the game yet, you can buy it on Steam, PS5 and Xbox, and also Epic Store like before. So yeah, great game. I also have a review on it on the channel. Oh yeah, and we will also play The Hobbit on Hobbit Day, which is, one of my favorite games from my childhood. I don't know why, but I couldn't finish it. I was so bad. I think it was the second chapter or mission, whatever you call it, with the trolls, and I just became lost in the caves, and I couldn't really figure out what to do. And I was rather young back then, so my English wasn't very good, so I didn't really understand what I had to do. I was just walking around endlessly until I had to give up. Then a few years after that, I picked up the game, and I guess for once I actually sit down and read the tutorial and what I had to do, and then it took like 5 seconds to actually get past that point. Yeah, and then I finished the game in like a few hours. So we're gonna play that again, and this time it will be on PC. I actually played it on my other channel, I think 3 years ago already. So it will be nice to return to it. I think it's a fun adventure game. Okay, we have a question. If you could see a particular character's storyline adapted to the big screen from all of Tolkien's works, which character would it be and why? Well, it's a tough question. There are a ton of great characters, and I don't think there's a ton of great films or TV shows coming out these days. Even games seems to be, less gamey and less entertaining at this point, and more political. So, I'm gonna assume it would be done faithfully, or at least like as faithfully as Peter Jackson did. And in that case, it would be the story about Turin Turambar, the whole Children of Húrin. It's my favorite story. It's not really. I'm not sure if it would work well today, because it's really. It's not that political correct, and it is truly an epic. So to get back to the video thumbnail I have here, yeah, I don't think they would pull it off well. But I love Turin as a character. I think he's extremely misunderstood, which to me just makes him even more interesting. And I think he's one of the characters often forgotten, or at least not given credit. I mean, he did slay Glaurung, so he's a cool character. He killed the dragon, yet he is rarely mentioned, I feel. But yeah, that would be great. I love the story. Would it be one film? Nah, I don't think it would. Perhaps 2 or 3 films. Especially now that we know that the upcoming one, The Hunt for Gollum, will be 2 films. Why? It just keeps on going, doesn't it? It really reminds me of back in the days when we heard about The Hobbit coming out, and first it was 1 film, then it was 2 films, and it ended up becoming 3 films. And it really shouldn't. It really shouldn't. I mean, 2 films, all right. 3, no, way too many. And I have a feeling we might end up in that situation again. I have heard some people speculate that the second part of the Hunt for Gollum will actually feature the War in the North. And you know, if we get that, that would be really great. The siege of Dale and Erebor and the death of Dane Ironfoot. You know, I think that could be a pretty great film, but why would you title it The Hunt for Gollum? Doesn't really make sense to me, but you know, some people think it's going to be like that. Yeah. You know, this mock is the best thing that came out of the Gollum game. All right, let's see some more questions. Okay, there's a lot. And special thanks to the High King Feanor, Alpha Chat of Middle Earth. Thank you very much. Oh, we have a question up there. All the best and timeless pieces of movies are straight from the books. I was part of the fandom then, and there was a massive pushback against Arwen at Helm's Deep. Jackson wanted a warrior princess. Yeah, I think it makes sense. But yeah, I totally agree. Some of the old stories are timeless for a reason. I think they talk to a fundamental part of human nature. It may sound a bit extreme, but I really think that. And it's also why I think Disney have been successful with their early stuff, because while they are redoing it in their own form and shape, there are still some fundamental ideas behind some of these stories. One I really liked was the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I think it's an interesting story. Yeah, for many reasons. So yeah, lots of great stories from the past. And you know, if we compare it to some of the new stuff they make, like, what was the name? Strange World? Who on earth went to see that? Honestly. You know. Yeah, so I think they should do more of the old stories, and there's still a lot to do. And I'm gonna talk about Beowulf and something about Norse mythology in a moment. But let's just do a few more of these questions. Do you have a biography video or of your history with Tolkien? How you came to it? What language originally read it in? How it developed? Actually, I sort of have. I'm not sure if all of you know this, but on the community we have a sort of ping pong where you guys could ask me a ton of questions, and then I would take my time to actually go through them and answer. I think it was 79 questions, and you can read it for free over on Patreon. But you know what? I think we will actually look it up, because we can talk about a lot of stuff here. So, great question. I'll get back to that. There's a modern obsession with turning the lust for power into a virtue. Yeah, totally agree. I think it's one of the weak points in many films now, that every character has to be, you know, sort of grey. And like I said before, it's also one of the reasons Sauron in the Rings of Power doesn't really work well. You know, to sort of put it in a chronological order, he's evil, then he wants to be evil but is murdered by orcs, flees like a black goo kind of thing, kills an innocent woman, clearly still evil, comes to fake Mordor and flees with them, but is still sort of evil and leaves, he leaves a man behind to die. I don't consider that good, at least. Then he comes across Galadriel and pretends to her that he wants to be good, or at least turn away from evil, and then she sort of push him to become evil, but he hasn't really done anything to prove that he's not evil. And, well, if we walk back again and talk about the whole philosophy about evil, it's not really something you just switch on and off, and there's no real moral ambiguity about what's good and evil. Evil is the absence of good, which is also why, in theory at least, everyone can be redeemed. It may seem impossible to us because men, elves, dwarves, and hobbits, it's not really up to them to redeem anyone or forgive people for that matter. That is put for Eru. But yeah, there's a lot more to talk about that. And we actually will in the upcoming video about the orc within us. Have you played the War of the North game? Yeah, I have. It's actually installed right here. And I think we will play it at some point. I just don't know when. Perhaps in October or November. We'll see. I really loved it. It's a great game. It's pretty lore friendly compared to the Shadow of Mordor games. Yeah, it definitely is. The story in it is pretty made up, but the locations and some of the characters are pretty much spot on. Jackson didn't let Pippin kill a troll. That's a crime. I agree. It's sort of interesting, really, because, in the book, each hobbit actually accomplishes some great deeds, but Pippin, not as much. But he kills a troll, but not in the film. So he's pretty much reduced to the fool. Which hobbit? The PS2 one? Yep, that one. By Sierra Entertainment, if memory serves. Okay, I think we went through all the questions. No, there's one. Do you think the dwarves really killed Fram? Interesting question. No, I don't think they did. It's plausible. After all, they are greedy. But I think when you think about it, if you sort of put it in perspective, when you look at the Rohirrim, the descendants of the Eotheoth, where Fram was their leader, they have a lot of misconceptions about the world. So, for starters, they think Galadriel is some evil sorceress, which is untrue. They also think the Druidine are evil, and I think they say they are related to orcs, so maybe it's a theory, I don't know, but also absurd. And they have some pretty racial hatred for the Dunlendings, even though they are perhaps not that different after all, but they sort of are in some ways at least. And I think the Ents, they also sort of mistrust. I feel there's a line, can't remember by which character, but after the Battle of Helm's Deep is sort of over, they see the Ents, and there's some sort of line about them. Can't remember the exact one, but yeah, they have a lot of misconceptions about the outside world, so it wouldn't really be strange to me that they have that about the dwarves as well. And perhaps Bram died some unnatural death, and they blame the dwarves because of this sort of dispute. It would make sense. But I think what is more plausible, if he died and was killed, is that he was perhaps just killed by orcs. After all, they lived pretty close to Mount Gundabad. So it would make sense in that regard. What are your thoughts on Faramir's movie character? Oh god, that's one of the things I've added into the upcoming video about the top 10 worst changes Peter Jackson made to the Lord of the Rings. Well, I would say they are two very different characters. I don't really hate the character in the film, but I don't love him either. And I think he's too far from what Tolkien wrote. And I think Book Faramir is one of the best characters in a way, because he's actually, by accident, related to the video about glorifying war. There are some connections between Tolkien and Faramir, and I think some of the lines we get from Faramir truly highlights the wisdom of Tolkien and how to perhaps act in war, that you should never go to war out of hatred for your enemy, but rather out of love for that which you defend. So yeah, great lines, and I think he's, in the books, one of the strongest and best characters, because he's pretty much the only character that wants to reject the ring and not use it even in the service of good, because he knows that eventually he wouldn't be good, he would actually just become another tyrant. And interestingly enough, we actually have a line about that in one of Tolkien's letters about his father Denethor, that he would just use the ring, and even if he managed to defeat Sauron, he would just pretty much become like him. And I think that's truly important when it comes to the ring and the power it has. You need to understand that you can actually never use the ring for good, because eventually it would corrupt you. All right. You got any news about Kingdoms of Arda? No. I can say that I don't work on it very actively, mainly because I'm so busy with this. In case you don't know, I have been so lucky to take, I hope I phrased this right, but an internship for my own company, which is the channel. So otherwise I had to do it for a different company, but there are certain rules, so I wouldn't actually be able to, earn any money, and I would have to work like a full-time job. So I've been so lucky I could actually take that time and use for this channel and try and grow it into something new, perhaps big enough to make a living. I don't know, at some point perhaps. So yeah, that's why you see a lot more videos recently as well. I feel I had more to say about that, but yeah, maybe it will come up. I have theories on Pippin's true role. I really need to write them out probably and share them at some point. Yeah, that would be great. Sounds good. War begins with the declaration of war. Yeah. Who knows what happened? If you could change or add something to the Lord of the Rings movies, what would you change? Well, I think it's a tough question. I think if we talk story-wise, they made a great mistake about how they ended Saruman's story. And understandably, it's also why Christopher Lee was pissed off. I think it's a weak point story-wise, because he's like, I wouldn't say the main villain, but the villain you get to know best in both the first and second film, and then he's just completely cut out from the third film, unless you count the extended cut where he's like, is it 10 minutes? That scene is really short also. So, you know, if we talk about how to make a good story, I think that's a weak point I would probably change. I'm not really sure I would say the scouring of the Shire should be there, because I think it was also good in some ways that he cut it out, though it's quite different from what Tolkien wanted. But if we talk about story structure, it makes sense he cut it out. But yeah, I would change Saruman's role, I think. But if we talk about the lore, well, what would I change? I would certainly cut out the stuff with the Limbus bread in Mordor, as Frodo and Sam are climbing the stairs to Shelob's lair. I would cut that out, that's for sure. And also the whole business about Arwen being tied to the One Ring, which we discussed briefly before. Yeah, I think I would do that, make it more true to what Tolkien actually wrote, especially Faramir, Denethor. You know, I think Denethor is actually an interesting choice to change. He's really misunderstood by a lot of people. And I guess it makes sense why they wouldn't, in the film, show his suicide with the Palantir. It might have been too extreme, but I really dislike how in the book it's sort of a tragedy, his downfall, and in the films it's reduced to some sort of comedy where he's on fire and running, how much is it, 300 meters, perhaps more. Why? I don't like that change. All right, let's move on. Let me just take this down. I think it's fine. Okay, let me just pull this up a bit. There we go. All right, so I'm going to talk about two interesting ways I'm actually connected to Tolkien's works, or more specifically, two of the sources that inspired him the most. And it's not something I've known for that long, but it's the story about Beowulf, and from Norse mythology, it is the story about Sigurd and the dragon Fafnir. So, you know, let's start with Beowulf. And I know this story is not that familiar with people at this point. It's not like Superman or Iron Man or something like that. So very briefly, the story of Beowulf is from an Anglo-Saxon poem titled that. And it's about a great warrior from modern day southern Sweden. So he's a Geat, as it's called. And he traveled to Denmark at some point. And he came to help the king of Denmark at that time, called Hrothgar, or Rowah in Danish. And he had a problem with a monster called Grendel. So Beowulf comes, slays the monster, and then later on Grendel's mother is the next problem, and Beowulf also kills her. And then the sort of third act of the poem is him becoming king in the land of the Geats, where a dragon attacks and he kills the dragon. And there's also some connections to The Hobbit here, actually, where he enters the lair and steals a golden cup, just like Bilbo does. But how am I related to that story at all? Isn't it all just a myth? I think something interesting that Tolkien also comments upon is that today we see myths as untrue, but there are often truth to be found in them. And I think that's also why the Lord of the Rings have become so popular, because yes, it's in a fictional world with fictional characters and so forth, but it still has a certain truth to it about the human nature and you know, overcoming corruption, temptation, being a true friend. Yeah, a lot of stuff. And what's interesting about the story about Beowulf is that for centuries it's widely believed to just have been a story, but we have actually recently discovered that perhaps there is a certain amount of truth to it. So in case you don't know, I grew up in Denmark and I'm Danish through and through. And I actually grew up very close to where King Hrothgar ruled. And we haven't known this for that long, but he ruled from, how am I going to say this? He ruled from a village called Lejre in Danish. And what's interesting about that is they actually rebuilt a sort of village next to that village, but in you know, the Viking era style. And one of the things we know from the tale about Beowulf is that Hrothgar has a grand hall called Heorot. And for very long it was just believed to be part of the story. You know, there's also dragons, so why should the hall be true but not the dragon, if that makes sense? But then they discovered there was actually a great hall in that area, which to me is shocking. And not only that, but they actually rebuilt that hall, so you can actually visit it and see it for yourself. And it's pretty big. I have actually seen it, though at the time I didn't know how important it actually was. It was on a school trip about 20 years ago, perhaps. A very long time ago, at least. But what's interesting is that the area I grew up was north of Lejre, so still part of the same municipality, but the place I grew up had actually people living there under the rule of Hrothgar. And let me just briefly talk about that area. In a way, it's not significant in any way, but to me it holds a certain kind of magic, if that makes sense. So let me talk about that briefly. Within 1 kilometer, there are 3 sort of Tolkienian things. So first of all, I grew up next to an open burial mound, a barrow, which in itself is quite unique. I think was 200 meters away from our house, so it was very close. I grew up in an area where you wasn't actually supposed to live. Not really sure how to say it in English, but summer residential housing. So it was only houses meant for people to stay there in the summer. But I grew up there. There wasn't a lot of people out there. But there was this open barrow, which is interesting in itself because you could actually enter it and see it for yourself. I'm rather tall, so I can't actually enter it today, but I did as a child, and I wouldn't really recommend it if you're claustrophobic. It's really tight in there. But it's interesting because it has an opening and you can actually enter it. Unlike most barrows in Denmark, there are thousands, at least hundreds. So most of them don't have an opening. And what's interesting about this one is that there are 2 openings actually. So it's quite unique, and sort of reminds me of the barrow built for Folklore and Folka, the sons. Is it Folka? Folklore? It's one of them at least. But yeah, the 2 sons of the Rohirrim king sent to aid Gondor, and then they die and are built in Twin Mount. So yeah, it sort of reminds me of that. And what's interesting about it is really that it has been there before Christ. So it's ancient. And all those houses around it were all built in the 60s or 70s. So not for very long actually, but for some reason it has remained sort of sacred. So people never really destroyed them. I really appreciate that. I think it's extremely interesting to think that the stones standing there have been there for so long. I mean, they were there long before any of us, long before our parents. They stood there when Napoleon was defeated in Waterloo. They stood there when Caesar was stabbed in the Senate. And, I don't think the human mind can really comprehend all that. It's such a long time, and it's truly ancient. And that's really what's fascinating about that barrow to me, though I think most people wouldn't understand it. But I hope to make a sort of mini documentary about it, perhaps next year, along with the 2 other things. So the other thing is the creek going through a valley. And if you know anything about Denmark, it's extremely flat. So, even a valley is quite unique in Denmark. I've only seen perhaps 2 or 3, so growing up next to one is quite unique. But the creek is actually called the Elf Pond Creek, if I had to translate it. And what's interesting is that we have a very unique distinction between elves, like in Tolkien's world and folklore, and the sort of elves that help Santa. There's no Dane on the whole planet that would ever say that those 2 things are the same. Not the same word, not the same kind of creature at all. Not even near it, to be honest. But the name actually refers to the kind of elves that we have in Tolkien's Middle-earth. So it's an interesting name. Why would it be called that? And, Tolkien really loved philology and the history behind words and names. So I think that's an interesting thing to dive into. And let me get some water. And yeah, the last thing is a huge rock, which has a sort of imprint of a hand into it. And the legend goes that it's thrown by a troll from the nearby village, 4 kilometers away. I don't really see the hand myself, but that's the folklore behind it at least. So that's also interesting, and again, it's also sort of Tolkienian at least. So to backtrack and put it shortly, I, in sort of a way, grew up in the area where Beowulf takes place. So that was at least surprising to me, that I was sort of connected to Tolkien in a way I didn't know. And I find it interesting because I actually, as a child, really connected with Tolkien's works through nature, like these 3 places I just mentioned. So to even think that area was even remotely connected to Beowulf, one of the greatest inspirations for Tolkien, That was sort of mind-blowing for me, at least. So yeah, that's one way I'm sort of connected to the sources, at least, that inspired Tolkien. So that's really fascinating for me, at least. And the other one is connected to Norse mythology, the story about Sigurd and Fafnir. And I'm not really sure where to start from this, but I descend from the first couple of kings of Denmark. So there's Gorm the Old, Harald Bluetooth. I think in English you call him Svein Forkbeard, something like that. But yeah, him as well, and Estrid, that also becomes the sort of last name for the whole dynasty. And I think that's not really unique in itself. A lot of people are, they just don't know it. But luckily I've been able to track it back through my great-grandmother, because her sister actually was sort of interested into that. What's interesting about Denmark is that it has never been conquered. It was occupied by the Nazis for 4 years, 5 years, something like that. I think it's 5 years. And other than that, the Germans took part of southern Jutland in 1864, and then we got it back after the First World War. But throughout the entire history of Denmark, since the Viking Age, it has not been conquered, and for that reason all the churches have never been burnt down, and they have a very great record of every people that have been baptized. And we have come into a very digital age, so you can actually find these records online, which makes it sort of easy to track your lineage. So for, I think, 4 centuries, my ancestors were pretty much just, he was called Tersten Pedersen, so the son of Peder, and then his son was called Peder Terstensen, so Peder, son of Tersten, and then it just, came for 4 centuries. So yeah, but before that they were nobles. So yeah, there were some noblemen, I don't want to talk about him, but yeah, he descended from the kings. And just to go all the way back to Gorm the Old, he is, according to legend, and this is where it sort of disconnects from what we do know to myths again, but according to legend or myth, whatever you want to call it, he was the grandson or great-grandson of, no, I think it was son or grandson of Sigurd the Snake in the Eye. So he was a Viking king of Denmark with he had a special eye with the Fafnir in it. And that's really the connection, because he is allegedly the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar Lothbrok in Danish. But I'm sure many of you know of him because of the series Vikings, where sadly my ancestor have been depicted as some sort of weakling playing the lute all day long. But yeah, in the real history he was pretty a pretty brutal guy from what I know. I mean, he had a dragon in his eye, so he doesn't strike me as a good guy. But yeah, his mother was Aslog, and Aslog is the daughter of Sigurd. Now, the story about Sigurd is that he came to help a king called Regin, and Regin had a brother called Fafnir, and he wasn't really a good guy. Fafnir had killed his father to gain a golden ring that would turn you incredibly rich. So perhaps you can already guess that it's very much the inspiration for the One Ring. And it's also why Fafnir murdered his father, stole the ring, went to a cave, and eventually became a dragon. And Regin wanted Sigurd to kill the dragon. And they tried to forge a weapon, but it was the third time when the shards of Gram was reforged that he was actually able to slay the dragon. So there's also a sort of connection there to Narsil being reforged, as you can probably hear. Even the name Gram is used twice by Tolkien, both for King of Rohan and also Mount Gram with the Orcs. So there's a lot of stuff, of course. But yeah, that's the connection. So if you believe in myths and legends, my ancestors descended from Sigurd, who killed the dragon Fafnir. So I think it's interesting. I think a lot of people descend from him, to be honest, but to know that it's more true than just a story is interesting to me, at least. As a child, I actually told a few people that I descended from the first kings, but I didn't know it. So it was actually a lie that became true in a way. Yeah, I don't know. It's funny to me, at least. But yeah, that's really the connection. And you know what? We're pretty much through the list. So there's only the giveaway left. But I want to see if you guys have any more questions. All right. So we have a question from a third-party studio. Can you settle a debate for me and a friend? Is The Lord of the Rings 1 book or 3 books? Well, I could provoke you and say it's 6 books, I think. Tolkien wanted to make more than 3 books, which is also, when you read it, you can see some of the pages. It says book 1, book 2, and book 3, and so forth. So it's debatable. You can buy an edition where it's just 1 book, but most people have the books where they're split into 3, of course. So to settle the question, both are correct and incorrect at the same time, and you could also argue for 6, I guess. Yeah. All right, let's move up. Fastred, yeah, Folklore and Fastred, that's correct. Have you seen the Beowulf TV series? No, I didn't know there was one. I watched the film that was sort of animated, but not really. I think it had some good stuff in it, but also a lot of bad stuff. And I think what they fundamentally get wrong is what Tolkien truly loved about that story. And it's a concept called Northern Courage. And it's actually something we see with the Rohirrim. I think the best example is when they ride to the aid of Gondor. They ride to certain defeat, ride to certain death, but despite that, they fight on. Not because they believe in victory, but because it's the right thing to do. That's pretty much Northern Courage. And it's also what you see in the story about Ragnarok. So, despite knowing that it will end badly, the gods fight on. And I think that inspired Tolkien to some way. And then he had his own twist with Catastrophe again. So, a sudden turn where the forces of good suddenly win. So, yeah. Beowulf is an interesting story. Danish, cool. I'm in the Eastfold to your north. Well, hello. I'm pretty sure that's in Norway. I think there's also the Westfold. Cool. Thank you very much. You grew up in the 1900s? No, I didn't. I'm 29, if in case people are interested. Is a burial mound. Alright, Kahina Lauren has some interesting stuff about Eastfold Barrows. Sounds cool. Yeah, I expect there are tons of them in Norway as well. What I didn't tell is there's actually another barrow right next to the other one. It's just has a tree growing on top of it, and that's pretty much it. All right. Real life lore, yeah. Ragnar Lothbrok was Swedish. His father was Sigurd the Ring, so and he was a legendary king of Sweden. So yeah, in that regard, but he became king of Denmark. So is he Swedish? Is he Danish? Is he Norwegian? It's pretty much the same thing to some extent. And the concept of Sweden didn't exist really at the time per se. So Denmark a little more. We also have the legendary king called Froda. So clearly also an inspiration for Frodo. And he's actually sort of connected to the story of Beowulf as well. I think it's Hrothgar's daughter that marries him, something like that. Can you do a whole series about this? I actually plan to do something more in regards to where I grew up. So a sort of mini documentary, I would call it. Hopefully next summer when, you know, the weather is getting a little better again. I just need a car again so I can actually get out there, and also a drone so, you know, we can have some nice shots. So that's one thing. And I also want to do a series, perhaps not a series, but at least one video about following the footsteps of Beowulf. So hopefully some sort of a collaboration with the area that has rebuilt the Hall of Heorot. I think that would be really cool. And you know, since I'm trying to turn this channel into a sort of business, it might also be a great way to get some funding from the Danish government, because I don't think they realize the importance of Beowulf and that story. In fact, oddly enough, barely any Danes know about it, and I guess even fewer would know that it takes place most of the time, at least in Denmark. So you know, it could be an interesting way to try and get some funding, because it sort of talks about Danish history, some legendary kings, and you know, sagas. So maybe it will attract tourists. I don't know. I'll leave that up to them. But it could be interesting. Yeah, there's a anime called the Vinland Saga. Yeah, inspired by Denmark and Norwegian folklore. Yeah, I actually discovered it while making the first video about the Fall of Arnor. I think I have one artwork from it, inside of it. Okay, so Cyan Forkbeard is a character in it. Okay, that's interesting. I might actually see that. It was a tale that grew into telling. Indeed. You sound older than you look. Yeah, I've actually heard that since kindergarten, to be honest. So it's a long story that seems to never really change, apparently. The British Beowulf TV show was absolutely ridiculous. I don't know. I haven't heard about it, so can't be too great, I guess. Final Fantasy style animation. Yeah, I think I'll skip that. Was Tolkien inspired by the Battle of Catalonian Plains? Yes, I think so. At least if memory serves, it's the one where there's a character called Theodoric, something like that, which should at least be the inspiration for Theoden. I'm actually pretty sure it's mentioned in this book. There's at least a mentioning of a character very similar to Theoden. And I think it's the battle you mentioned, so yeah, to keep it short. You mentioned once that you are not a native English speaker. Your English is really decent. Thank you very much. May I ask where you're from? Yeah, I'm from Denmark, more specifically Sealand. So west from Copenhagen. And it's where I grew up. I grew up north from a village or town called Roskilde, which is the old capital of Denmark back in the Middle Ages. And I think it's pretty famous worldwide because of a huge festival held there each year. And yeah, it's also interestingly enough connected to Hrothgar from Beowulf. As mentioned, his name in Danish is actually Rowah. So Roskilde, Roskilde in Danish, actually means Rowah's spring. So it's named after him, which is pretty cool as well. What's your favorite non-Middle Earth Tolkien book? I don't think I have one. I just like everything connected to Middle Earth. So, you know, it might actually be this one. Perhaps not really a story, but it opened my eyes for fairy stories as a whole, and perhaps also changed my perception about fairies and, you know, many of these old stories about King Arthur and so forth. And if you're into this kind of stuff, you should read this. Have you seen the Ring of Nibelung's TV miniseries? No, I haven't. But yeah, as far as I know, it's also a sort of inspiration for the whole tale about Sigurd and Fafnir as well, and also something Tolkien was extremely inspired by. My family were Danish noblemen, apparently from Åbenrå, so perhaps we are related. Perhaps we are. Seems possible. Is there a Ministry of Fairies in Denmark? No, there isn't. But actually, something I also talk about in the sort of interview we had is that there are a lot of things from Danish history, especially way back, that inspired Tolkien, but also some folklore. And actually this brings us back to this one again, because it's actually mentioned here. Can't really remember where, but it's near the end. So there was a Danish guy called Grundtvig. He wrote a lot of songs for the church, and that he was also sort of popular in Denmark and still is, though he's been dead for a very long time. I think it was his son that collected a lot of stories about Danish folklore, and interestingly enough, there's a lot about elves, fairies, and there's even something closely to this connection to the water and rivers, and I would even say the river daughter, so Goldberry. But yeah, it's something I was sort of forced into read in ground school, so it's not something I remember very well, and it's also written in very old Danish, which is extremely hard to read for modern Danes, which is really sad because it's actually the same with The Lord of the Rings. And it was truly challenging to read as a child because it was translated in 64, I think. So the way Danes would speak back then is very different from now. So there's a lot of old words. Nobody really seems to understand what it means today. So if you have to read it in Danish, you sort of need a dictionary to help you actually understand what is written down. And I think there's also some of the differences between Danish and Swedish, because the Swedes have invented new words for pretty much everything, like computer, software, and so forth, whereas in Danish we actually just use those words. So the language is sort of changing to become more English in many ways. Of course, there are some odd examples like fitness, which has become a Danish word but pronounced differently. So we say fitness instead of fitness. So lots of examples of that, of something like that. But yeah, I highly recommend this. Right, well, I don't have more to say, so thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you will be here in 1 hour and 30 minutes when we return to Moria and actually play that game. Thank you all for watching, and as always, farewell till next time.